Okay, today we are in our book, A History of U.S., the First Americans, and we are reading Chapter 15. Chapter 15. A boy named Christopher has a dream. This will be a read aloud and think aloud. When Christopher Columbus was a boy, he had two dreams. One was to go to sea, the other was to get to China. When he grew up, he thought he had done both. Columbus was born in Genoa, an Italian city on the Mediterranean Sea. Genoa was prosperous because of the sea trade, and many Genoese boys wanted to be sailors. Columbus became one of the best the world has ever known. So it sounds like Columbus grew up wanting to be a sailor, and that it was a common ambition for many of the boys where he lived because their city, Genoa, was very prosperous because of the sea trade. Columbus knew about China because he had read Marco Polo's book. He had read it carefully. His copy of the book is full of notes. Most people in the 15th century couldn't read. That meant they were ignorant of many things. Some believed the world was flat. They thought if you sailed too far, you'd fall off the edge. But people who could read, like Columbus, knew that wasn't so. Scientists had proof that the world was round, and they told about it in books. So it sounds like Columbus kind of has an advantage here in that he was able to read. And back then, that was not very common. There was a problem, though. No one was quite sure how big the world was, so no one knew how far you would have to sail to go around it. One way to try and figure that out was by measuring lines of longitude and latitude. Longitude and latitude are very useful lines. How about looking at a map? That is the only way you'll understand what is coming next. Check in an atlas or turn to the next page. Do you see the thin lines going up and down and across the map? Those are lines of longitude and latitude. They are imaginary lines. You won't see them if you look down from an airplane. They are drawn on maps to help map readers divide up the globe. Latitude and longitude lines make it easy to read a map and measure the Earth. So nobody knew how big the Earth was, and they did not know how far you would have to sail to go all the way around the Earth. But they did use lines of latitude and longitude to try to help measure. We still use those lines of latitude and longitude on our maps today. Think of the Earth as a big, fat man. Put a belt around his middle. That belt is a line of latitude. We call it the equator, or a 0-degree line of latitude. Latitude lines are numbered north and south of the equator. Now give the fat man a round cap. The edge of the cap is the Arctic Circle, which is the 66.5-degree line of latitude north, or 66.5-degree in, of the equator. The center of the cap is the North Pole, which is 90 degrees north. Turn the fat man the other way, and the cap on the globe becomes the Antarctic Circle. Now it has the South Pole as its center. And now those numbers are 66.5 degrees south and 90 degrees south. Lines of latitude circle the globe and run parallel to each other. Some people even call them parallels. Parallel lines are an equal distance from each other and never touch, like the sides of a ladder. So that's one way we can remember latitude is the across going up and down, just like the slats on a ladder. Latitude. Lines going the other way from the North Pole to the South Pole are lines of longitude. Longitude lines are not parallel. They all touch at the poles but spread far apart at the center. One more thing. Those lines of longitude and latitude are actually circles. They circle the globe. If you divide the Earth at the equator, that 0-degree line of latitude, you get two halves. Those halves are hemispheres. Another word for a globe or a ball is a sphere. Half a sphere is a hemisphere. We live in the northern hemisphere. If you divide the world in half along a line of longitude, you will also get two hemispheres. This time they are eastern and western hemispheres. To tell longitude from latitude, remember that the first syllable of latitude rhymes with fat. like the belt around our fat Earth. Longitude starts with long, like the long distance from the North Pole to the South Pole. If you know longitude and latitude, you can always tell where you are, on land or sea. Latitude is easy to figure out if you can read the stars, or if you measure the angle of the sun at noon with an instrument called a sextant. But longitude isn't easy, especially on a ship. You need to know exactly how far you have traveled from where you started. You probably know the math, distance equals speed multiplied by the time taken. A seaman could make a crude guess at a ship's speed by watching its hull cutting through the water. But to calculate exactly the time you've taken, you need a really accurate clock that keeps very good time. To tell time in the 15th century, ships had hourglasses filled with sand, which you turned over every half hour when the sand ran out. If the sailor who turned over the hourglass dozed off, well, you can see how easy it was to make mistakes. So ships at sea hardly ever knew exactly where they were, and that problem wasn't solved until the 18th century when very good clocks began to be made. So it sounds like if Columbus is a sailor in the 15th century, it sounds like they really don't have very good ways of judging how far they've gone and exactly where they are. They have an instrument called a sextant, and they have an hourglass. And it sounds like that is what they depended on to figure out where they are. Columbus did not worry. He knew Spain and Japan, he called it Capango, were on the same line of latitude. So if he could just stick with it, he figured he'd land in Japan. And he would have, if the American continent hadn't gotten in the way. Columbus, by the way, was very smart. He did everything well, except one thing. When he measured the earth, he goofed. So he made a mistake. He was very, very smart, but he did make a mistake here. He figured the earth was much smaller than it is. He also figured that Cathay was much larger than it is. Actually, it wasn't Columbus's fault that he was mixed up. He studied the work of an ancient Greek geographer called Ptolemy. And if Ptolemy had been right, China would be where America is. If you compare Ptolemy's map on this page with a modern map, you will see just how mixed up Columbus was. So Columbus made this mistake because he relied on the work of Ptolemy. And unfortunately, Ptolemy was not accurate because he did not know about the American continent. According to his map, China should be where America actually is. So that was a mistake that Columbus made, but again, he didn't know that the Americas were there. Now, as you know, people who could read knew the world was round. They understood that if you went west from Europe, you would finally get to Asia. But no one wanted to try going that way. It seemed too dangerous and too far. Most people believed there were ferocious monsters in the deep waters. Every sailor knew the dangers of storms at sea. So it sounds like everybody back then knew that if you sailed west from Europe, you could get to Asia going that way. But nobody wanted to try it. Because Columbus believed the earth was small, and because he was a superb sailor, he thought he could make it to Cathay. So he went to Portugal to ask for help. Remember Prince Henry the Navigator and his mathematicians? Well, Henry had died in 1460, but the Portuguese were still world leaders in exploration and navigation. When the Portuguese mathematicians figured out the size of the earth, it came out much bigger than it did for Columbus. Today we know they had it just about right, but back then nobody was sure because nobody had actually sailed around the globe. Anyway, the Portuguese weren't willing to take the risk. They turned Columbus down. So Columbus first went to the Portuguese. He went to Portugal to ask them for help in planning and paying for this voyage. And he went to them because the Portuguese were world leaders in exploration and navigation, and it was because they had leading mathematicians. However, the Portuguese did not want to take the risk, so they would not sponsor Columbus. They turned Columbus down. So did almost everyone else. Columbus took his ideas to one person after another. Each one said sorry, except King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, who said perhaps. So now Columbus has found somebody who might be willing to take the risk. Maybe they were just being polite because they seemed to forget all about Columbus. Years passed. He asked them again, and this time they said no. One thing you can say for Columbus, he never gave up. He was on his way to see the King of France when a messenger called him back to Spain. Finally, Ferdinand and Isabella had agreed to help. They gave him 3 small ships and some sailors and sent him in search of China and Japan. So he's being turned down by everybody. Nobody wants to help him. Nobody takes the risk. Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella said maybe. And then years passed and you never heard back from him, and then they said no. So Columbus, because he's not going to give up, decided he was going to sail to go see the King of France and ask him to sponsor his voyage. And he was on his way to France when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella decided that they were willing to take the risk and they would sponsor Columbus. So even though Columbus was from Italy, when he sailed and found the Americas, he was sailing for Spain and the King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella.